Rep. Crockett refused to ask Bondi any questions, then made her point without her. She turned away from the witness. Rep. Jasmine Crockett walked to the microphone with her time allocation and announced directly and without ceremony that she was not going to ask the Attorney General any questions. Not because she didn't have questions, because she had watched the hearing for long enough to reach a specific conclusion. This witness had no intentions of answering questions, so she was not going to ask her any. She turned instead to Rep. Becca Balint, sitting at the committee dais. Balint represents Vermont in the House. She was present at the committee hearing in her capacity as a Democratic member. By answering Crockett's questions, she participated in what became a documented exchange in the congressional record, one in which a member asked 3 moral questions and received 3 direct answers, creating a contrast that the hearing transcript now preserves. Balint's role in the exchange was not passive. She understood what Crockett was doing, and her willingness to answer directly, wrong, definitely wrong, provided the documentary evidence that Crockett was building. 2 members demonstrating that simple moral questions have simple answers, in a room where the Attorney General of the United States had spent hours not answering far more complex ones. Crockett practiced as a criminal defense attorney in Texas before entering Congress. She represented clients in a system where the quality of witness testimony, its responsiveness, its consistency, its credibility determines outcomes. She has sat across from witnesses who didn't want to answer questions. She has cross-examined people who deployed evasion, redirection, and non-answers as defensive strategies. She knows from professional experience the difference between a witness who can't answer a question and a witness who won't. She also knows the institutional tools that courts use to address the second category. You can compel, you can move to strike non-responsive answers. You can have the judge instruct the witness to answer the question that was actually asked. Congressional hearings don't have the same enforcement mechanisms, but the professional recognition of the pattern is the same. What Crockett was doing when she turned away from Bondi and toward her colleague was applying her professional assessment of what this particular witness had decided to do. The hearing was not a trial. There was no judge to compel. There was no mechanism to strike non-responsive answers from the record. What she had was 5 minutes and a colleague who was willing to demonstrate by answering 3 simple questions what a responsive witness looks like. She had 3 questions. They were not complicated. They were not trick questions. They were not legal questions that required expertise or institutional knowledge. They were moral questions, the kind that any adult with a functioning conscience can answer in one word. Right or wrong, raping children? Balint said wrong. Right or wrong, killing random citizens? Balint said definitely wrong. Right or wrong, enriching yourself as the sitting president of the United States? Balint said definitely wrong. Crockett looked at the room and said, "Thank you, because I probably never would have gotten that from our witness." This channel tracks the documentation as it moves through the legal system. If you want to follow where this goes, subscribe and turn on notifications. New videos drop when the record produces something worth documenting. Let's start with the strategy, because the strategy is the argument. Crockett knew Bondi would not answer direct questions. She had been watching for the entire session. The pattern was established. She adjusted her strategy before she reached the microphone. The hearing had demonstrated that pattern repeatedly before Crockett's time arrived. Members had asked specific documented accountability questions and received deflections, attacks, stock market statistics, and one-word privilege invocations. The format of direct questioning had been tried by multiple members with multiple lines of inquiry, and the results were in the transcript. Not the accountability the hearing was designed to produce, but a documentary record of what the Attorney General would not say. Crockett's decision to ask her colleague, instead of the witness, was not a concession, it was an adaptation. She was acknowledging what the hearing had already established about this particular witness's approach to sworn testimony, and then finding a way to work within that reality rather than against it. She was not going to perform the ritual of asking questions that would not be answered. She was going to use her 5 minutes differently. The tactic has a specific institutional logic. Congressional oversight time is fixed and finite. Each member gets 5 minutes. A witness who deploys non-answers, redirections, and personal attacks can consume significant portions of that 5 minutes without ever addressing the substance of what is being asked. The member who spends their time trying to force an answer that the witness has decided not to give often ends the exchange with less in the record than the member who structures their time differently. Crockett had watched the hearing. She had watched colleagues' time allocations get consumed by the same pattern. She decided to use her time to produce something different. 3 direct answers to 3 direct questions, on the record, demonstrating the contrast between a witness willing to answer questions and the one sitting at the table. The 3 questions she posed to Balint were not arbitrary. They were the 3 core moral foundations of what the Democratic members had been trying to get Bondi to address throughout the hearing. Is sexual abuse of children wrong? Is the arbitrary killing of citizens wrong? Is a president using their office to enrich themselves wrong? Those 3 questions, and their obvious answers, are the baseline against which everything the Democratic members had been asking about: Epstein co-conspirators not charged, journalists arrested, cases dismissed for political reasons, was supposed to be evaluated. The ordering of those 3 questions has a logic worth examining. Children come first, the most fundamental category, the abuse of the most vulnerable, the category least susceptible to political reframing, the foundation on which the Epstein investigation's significance rests. If that baseline is not established, everything built on it is unstable. Citizens come second. The arbitrary killing of people by state actors is the category that connects to the broader claims about the DOJ's conduct in the field, the rogue agents, the masks, the videos that exist in the public record. If killing random citizens is wrong, then the accountability question for the specific documented conduct follows. The president comes third. Enriching yourself while holding the highest office in the country is the category that connects to the emoluments argument, the constitutional text that prohibits exactly that, and to the specific financial arrangements Crockett would subsequently cite. The sequence moves from the most universally agreed upon moral baseline to the more contested political accountability questions, establishing the undeniable before introducing the documented. The first question was about children, specifically about rape. It is the foundational question of the Epstein investigation, the investigation that the hearing was ostensibly about, the investigation whose co-conspirators had not been charged, whose documents had been withheld, whose victims had been exposed while abusers were protected. 3 questions, 3 one-word answers, the baseline established before the documentation was presented. Bondi, sitting at the witness table, was not being asked the questions. She was watching a colleague answer them in a room she had made herself unable to be the subject of through her own refusal to answer questions. The physical dynamic of that moment is worth sitting with. Crockett had turned her body away from the Attorney General. She was facing Balint. She was having a conversation with someone who was willing to participate in the accountability exercise the witness had declined to participate in. Bondi sat across the room, physically present, legally obligated to be there, not the recipient of the questions. The effect was to place Bondi in the position of an observer at a proceeding she had rendered herself unable to be the subject of through her own conduct. Then Crockett turned back to the hearing and named what she had just done. She said she was not sure what law school Bondi went to or what kind of cases she had tried. But typically, she said, when someone comes into a space and they are a witness, they sit there and answer questions instead of asking questions. There is also an objection, she noted, that lawyers use in courtrooms. It is called non-responsive. It applies when a witness fails to actually answer the question. Crockett was a lawyer before she was a congresswoman. She was not invoking the concept of a non-responsive witness rhetorically. She was identifying the specific legal category that describes what had been happening at the witness table throughout the hearing, and she was doing so in the language of professional practice, not political commentary. In legal proceedings, a non-responsive answer is a formal category with procedural consequences. When a witness answers a question with something other than the question asked, pivoting to a different subject, characterizing the questioner, providing information that is adjacent to but not responsive to the specific inquiry, opposing counsel can object on non-responsive grounds. The remedy depends on the context. In trial, the judge can instruct the witness to answer the question asked and can direct that the non-responsive portion be stricken from the record. The category exists because testimony's value depends on its responsiveness. A witness who can provide any answer to any question without consequence to the specific question asked produces a record that is narratively full but informationally empty. Congressional hearings operate with looser enforcement mechanisms. There is no judge to strike non-responsive answers. Members can reclaim their time, a procedural tool that stops the witness from speaking but does not compel an answer. What Crockett was doing when she named the non-responsive category was placing a legal characterization on the record. She was saying, what has been happening at this witness table has a name. It is a recognized failure mode in testimonial evidence, and it has been occurring repeatedly throughout this proceeding. She had named it, she had explained it, she had moved on. Bondi was still at the table. The survivors were still in the gallery. Then she turned to the survivors. The people sitting in the gallery behind Bondi had been in that hearing room for hours. They had been in prior hearing rooms. They had submitted testimony, filed legal briefs, made public statements, cooperated with congressional investigators, and done everything that people seeking institutional accountability through official channels can do. They had watched officials deploy Dow Jones statistics and mugshot lists and impeachment references and stock trader comments in response to questions about what was done to them. They had watched prior officials say near future about disclosure timelines and watched those timelines pass without the documentation arriving. They were in the room. They had been in every hearing room. Crockett addressed them. This is the element of Crockett's time that carried the most weight for the people in that gallery, and it deserves attention precisely because it required no legal argument and no documented evidence. It required only acknowledgement. She said, they are not victims, they are survivors. The distinction between those two words is not semantic. It is a choice about how to characterize the people sitting in that gallery. Victim is a legal and descriptive category. It identifies someone in relation to a crime that was committed against them. It places them in the position of the person to whom something was done. Survivor is a different category. It acknowledges the same experience but positions the person in relation to their own continuation rather than in relation to the crime. It says, you endured this and you are still here. Crockett said they had more courage and moral clarity in their pinky fingers than the entire Department of Justice. That statement, delivered to people who had been in multiple hearing rooms and had watched officials deploy every available deflection mechanism against the accountability they had been seeking, is the statement of someone who understands what it takes to keep showing up to those rooms, to keep submitting testimony, to keep sitting in the gallery through sessions that produce Dow Jones references and mugshot lists and requests to know whether Democrats have apologized to the president. It takes moral clarity to do that. It takes a specific kind of courage to be present repeatedly in a room where the institution that is supposed to be producing accountability for what was done to you keeps finding ways not to. Now let's talk about the written testimony versus the documented reality. Bondi's written testimony stated two goals for her tenure. First, end the weaponization of justice. Second, return the department to its core mission. Crockett said, not only have you lied about both, you've intentionally done the exact opposite. The evidence she cited for that claim was specific and documented. On the weaponization of justice, the DOJ had arrested Don Lemon and Georgia journalists. Don Lemon is a former CNN anchor who had been publicly critical of the Trump administration. Georgia Fort is a journalist whose arrest was part of what critics described as a pattern of federal action against media figures covering the administration. The president himself had stated publicly that the administration took the freedom of speech away, a statement Crockett cited as the administration's own characterization of its approach to press freedom. The detail about the judge's prior rejection of the Don Lemon arrest attempt is significant for what it establishes about the nature of the prosecution. A judge reviewing an arrest application found it insufficient and declined it. The department then proceeded anyway. The sequence, judicial rejection followed by continued pursuit, is documented and in the public record. Whether the eventual arrest succeeded where the prior attempt failed is a separate question from what the sequence says about the institutional persistence behind the effort. On returning to core mission, the grand jury rejected the case against Senator Kelly. The grand jury rejected the case against Senator Slotkin. The case against Tish James was dismissed. The case against Comey was dismissed. That list of grand jury rejections and dismissed cases is a specific kind of documentation. Grand juries reject cases when the evidence presented to them is insufficient to support the charges the prosecution is seeking. They do not reject cases because of political opposition to the prosecution. They are made up of ordinary citizens who are not elected, not appointed, and not subject to political direction. They reject cases because the evidence does not meet the legal threshold. A grand jury that refuses to indict is a group of private citizens saying, what the prosecution has shown us is not enough. A pattern of grand jury rejections and dismissed cases across multiple high-profile prosecutions is a documented record of what happened when the department's prosecutorial resources were applied to the targets in question. The cases against Senator Kelly, Senator Slotkin, Tish James, and Comey were not dismissed by political opponents of the administration. They were rejected or dismissed by the legal institutions through which prosecutions must pass. That pattern is the documented output of the department's prioritization. Journalists arrested, senators' cases rejected, Comey's case dismissed. The prosecutorial record is in the transcript, now the files. Crockett's argument was that those prosecutorial resources were misdirected. The DOJ was spending taxpayer resources arresting journalists while not prosecuting the people the Epstein investigation had documented. The ratio she was describing, more resources toward journalists and political opponents, fewer toward co-conspirators of a convicted sex trafficker, is the documented output of the department under Bondi's leadership. Then she presented the Epstein files data. She had documented the pattern of prosecution. Now she was going to document what wasn't being prosecuted. She said she was going to talk about facts. She enumerated them. Fact 1. Donald Trump is one of the most named people in the Epstein files. At least 5,000 files contain more than 38,000 references to Trump, his wife, or Mar-a-Lago. That number is from the released files. It is a documented count. It is in the record. 38,000 is not a number that represents casual social acquaintance. It represents a density of documented association, references distributed across 5,000 files in a federal investigation into sex trafficking. Those references appear in the context of a case whose files document the operation of a criminal network. Each reference does not constitute evidence of criminal conduct by the person referenced. But the density of the association, the recurrence of the name across thousands of documents in a specific investigative context, is itself a fact that the investigation's accountability process is supposed to address. At minimum, it is the kind of documented association that produces investigative questions. Whether those questions have been asked and what answers the department has found is part of the accountability record the hearings were trying to produce. Fact 2. According to documents in the Epstein files, Ghislaine Maxwell presented a young girl to Trump who spent more than 20 minutes apparently flirting with her. This is documented in the released materials, not from an anonymous source, from the filed documents themselves. Fact 3. FBI investigator notes in the Epstein files describe Epstein transporting a victim to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Trump, where Epstein allegedly told Trump, "This is a good one." Crockett stopped and stated her position precisely. She said, "I'm not saying the president is a pedophile, but there is a lot of evidence in these files that suggests he is very close friends with a lot of men who are." That formulation requires specific attention because it is doing something precise. It is not an allegation of presidential conduct. It is an observation about documented associations, about who appears repeatedly in a federal investigation's files, in what context, and in proximity to what other individuals. The distinction between being a pedophile and being documented as closely associated with people who are convicted sex traffickers is a legal and moral distinction that Crockett was drawing explicitly. She was working within the factual record. The facts are 38,000 plus references in the Epstein files, Maxwell's documented presentation of a girl to Trump, FBI notes describing Epstein transporting a victim to Mar-a-Lago. Those facts are in the released files. They are not allegations from anonymous sources. They are part of the federal investigative record. Crockett was presenting them as facts, characterizing them as proximity to a documented criminal network, and explicitly declining to draw a more severe conclusion from them. That restraint, the explicit "I'm not saying," is itself part of the statement. It delineates exactly how far the documented evidence goes and where the inference would have to stop. She was not accusing Trump of committing crimes. She was placing documented associations into the record and naming what those associations are proximate to. The hearing proceeded. Crockett yielded. Rep. Schmidt from Kansas was recognized. Schmidt thanked Bondi for being there. He noted that Crockett hadn't asked any questions. He gave Bondi the floor to respond to Crockett's 5 minutes. Bondi said Crockett hadn't condemned her Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, for taking money from Epstein after Epstein was convicted. Then she read a list. Cases from Texas, cases from the Dominican Republic, cases from Afghanistan. She named defendants by country of origin. She said, that's why they want to talk about Epstein and not what's happening in their own states. The mugshot list deserves examination as a rhetorical and strategic choice. Bondi had been given the floor by Schmidt specifically to respond to Crockett's 5 minutes. The response she chose was to read criminal case files from Texas, the Dominican Republic, and Afghanistan, cases involving violent crimes by individuals of foreign origin. The connection between those cases and anything Crockett had said in her 5 minutes is not documented in the transcript. Crockett had not asked about immigration, about crime rates by origin, or about any of the cases Bondi cited. She had asked about child rape, about killing citizens, about presidential self-enrichment, about Epstein co-conspirators, and about Trump's documented presence in the Epstein files. The mugshot list is the kind of response that changes the subject by introducing material that is viscerally compelling, violent crime images, names, countries of origin, without addressing any element of what it is responding to. It is designed to produce a different emotional register than the questions it is supposed to answer. Whether it constitutes an answer to Crockett's documented record of 0 co-conspirators charged, 38,000 Trump references and grand jury rejections is a question the transcript records without resolving. Schmidt said it had been quite a spectacle to observe. He added that it made him sad. He said he had run for Congress because he thought there were serious problems in this country he wanted to try to fix together. He said the performance had not shored up his confidence that Congress was up to the task. He said some of his colleagues' behavior, specifically the Democratic members' behavior, had produced this sadness. He praised Bondi and noted they had served together for 8 years. The serious problems Schmidt said he had run to address were not specified in his statement. What was specified in the same hearing session he called a spectacle was the documented record that had been presented in the preceding hours. 0 Epstein co-conspirators charged, 38,000 Trump references in the Epstein files, victim information published while abuser names were protected, journalists arrested, grand juries rejecting politically targeted prosecutions, an attorney general who said privilege to every document, survivors who had never been interviewed. Let's examine what Schmidt's spectacle characterization applies to. He called it a spectacle. The question is whose conduct he was describing. The hearing had produced a documented record of 0 Epstein co-conspirators charged, 3 million pages withheld, victim information published while abuser names were protected, a financial settlement, an email from Epstein to Maxwell about Trump, an 86-page prosecution memo hidden from Congress, a Florida draft indictment hidden from Congress, an attorney general who said privilege to every document, survivors whose raised hands documented that the deputy attorney general's public claim about victim outreach was false, a Dow Jones citation in an Epstein hearing, and an attorney general who spent her time attacking the credentials and prior conduct of the members, asking questions rather than answering them. Schmidt found this to be a spectacle. He said it made him sad. He said he had run for Congress to address serious problems. He said some of his colleagues' performance had not shored up his confidence that Congress was up to the task. His colleague was the Attorney General of the United States, who had produced the 0 indictments, the withheld pages, the published victim names, and the one-word privilege invocations. His criticism was directed at the people asking questions about those outcomes. Crockett had anticipated exactly this dynamic when she decided not to ask Bondi any questions. Bondi read the mugshot list. Schmidt called it a spectacle. Crockett had already yielded. She had made her point by not asking questions. The questions she didn't ask are still in the transcript answered by her colleague. She knew the format of direct questioning would produce what it had been producing all hearing: deflection, attack, non-responsive responses, and eventually the characterization of the questioners as the problem. She chose a different format. She asked her colleague 3 questions. She got 3 direct answers. She documented the gap between what an answerable question produces and what Bondi's testimony had been producing. She addressed the survivors directly. She put a specific factual record about the Epstein files and Trump's documented presence in them into the congressional transcript. And then she yielded. What followed, Bondi reading a mugshot list, Schmidt calling it a spectacle, the entire apparatus of Republican time allocation being used to criticize the people asking accountability questions, confirmed the analysis Crockett had made before she started speaking. This witness was not going to answer questions the Republican colleagues were not going to press her to. The spectacle, as Schmidt characterized it, was not the accountability questions. It was the absence of accountability in the answers. Crockett said, "You will be remembered as one of the worst attorneys general in history, an attorney general who prioritized obstruction over justice, corruption over law, fealty to the president over loyalty to the Constitution." The history of American attorneys general includes documented cases of officials who used the position to serve presidential interests at the expense of institutional independence. The offices of two attorneys general during the Nixon administration resulted in criminal convictions. The conduct of others in various administrations has been criticized in subsequent historical and legal analysis. Crockett's characterization of Bondi as among the worst in history is a comparative judgment made in a congressional hearing and entered into the permanent record, not as historical analysis, but as a sitting member's documented evaluation of a sitting official's documented performance. That sentence is in the permanent record of the House Judiciary Committee. It is attributed, it has Crockett's name attached to it. It is not an anonymous characterization. It is a sitting member of Congress, a lawyer, a former prosecutor herself, making a specific evaluative judgment about the Attorney General's tenure on the basis of the documented record she had just presented. The record she presented included 0 Epstein co-conspirators charged, journalists arrested, grand juries rejecting multiple high-profile cases, 38,000 Trump references in the Epstein files, and a department that had never interviewed the survivors sitting in the hearing room. Then Schmidt called it a spectacle. Bondi read the mugshot list the Republican time allocation wrapped up. The record contains all of it. The mugshot list, the 3 questions Balint answered, the pinky finger comparison, the 38,000 references, the survivors' hands. One of them is about the Epstein investigation. The others are what the hearing produced instead.